Editorial note. The warriors of Heathmoore would embark as promised with the changing of the tide. It was quite an impressive sight, let me assure you, I have to admit it. I stayed in my transport with the Sororitas, but I was often checking out the viewports to witness what was going on below in the sea. The sight of dozens upon dozens of large archaic ships drifting like an army on the march, it was actually quite something incredible to witness. Riding with me wasn't just the Sororitas either, but also Tzu Ying, the Psyker Sanhu that I had the pleasure of getting to know. We stayed with the fleet even as they stopped by Store Stronghold to pick up 3 large Jormungandr junks. And good thing we did, for that stop would prove to be highly important for the warriors of Heathmoore. The following log is, again, from the perspective of Night Warden William, and I deeply apologize again for relying on his account, but every other log I found on what occurred was just too far-fetched and distant from the truth. I had to go with the more accurate account as it stood, for without it, you may find what is described very hard to believe. However, there is one moment in the log that William is unaware of that I was made privy to, and at that juncture I will interject to share something that happened that William, frankly, doesn't know about and also doesn't need to know about. I stood on the bow of the ship, looking out over the churning sea. Night had fallen, and the only light that could be seen came from the lights and the lamps from the deck. Dark clouds had covered the night sky, keeping us from seeing the guiding light of the moon or stars. I was nervous. Beyond nervous. And I felt like I wasn't the only one. Looking from left to right, I could just barely make out the sights of other ships on the sides. I asked Captain Fan Ling constantly how she knew we wouldn't run aground or crash into an ally, and all she'd do was just laugh at my concerns and go back to whatever it was she was doing. I didn't know how to feel about her flippancy, but I also knew better than to question her sailing acumen. The waves looked rough, angry, and more than once I felt the sickening lurch of the ship buckle under my feet. "Captain!" a voice shouted from the far port. "Lights to starboard!" Fan Ling turned and walked to the starboard side of the ship to look through her looking-glass. She stared a moment before handing it over to me.
"What do you make of that, Night Warden?" she asked.
I looked, watching. There was definitely something there, and it was massive. There were small lights around the object that allowed me to just make out its shape. It appeared like a giant dock of some kind floating in the water, a huge barge with no walls or sails. On it were swirling, moving, and bouncing objects. I tried to look harder at the shapes, and again, to notice something uncomfortable. They weren't quite human, or perhaps they used to be. But what I saw were caricatures, muscled and their flesh red and, in some cases, growing protruding spines and spikes. Some had fangs and burning red eyes and horns. They were shouting, screaming, jumping up and down, and even cutting at each other in a mad fury. Yes, they were mad, devastatingly mad, and bloodthirsty. I hadn't seen anything like it, not since back at the Ashfeld capital. "What in the name of God?" I whispered.
"Seems it is an interception barge, set to block our path,"
Fan Ling answered. "Can we avoid them?"
"Not the whole fleet. We can bombard them with cannon fire, but you said yourself that we would need all the artillery support possible, and you couldn't store any catapults."
"Right. Perhaps we should have a few ships fall back and engage them, buy us some time. I don't want to risk any more lives, but we can't risk them barging into us," I offered. Fan Ling's eyes narrowed and she looked out at the clouds.
"I wouldn't advise it. Those clouds ahead are holding a storm. A mean one by my estimate, and it doesn't feel natural,"
she explained. I shot a cold glance at Fan Ling. Was she implying that the storm ahead wasn't natural? She was, in fact, and she was correct. It would seem the demon was well aware of what was coming and was intent to stop this fleet's progress. "So anyone who stays behind wouldn't make it through the storm even if they were successful," I finished the explanation for her. "So anyone who tries to stop them..."
"Will go back or die,"
Fan Ling explained. Damn it all. We can't afford to lose any one of our fighting force before we arrive. We have to be united in this crusade. Fan Ling looked back through her scope at the enemy and her face suddenly went visibly pale, which was impressive given how dark it was outside.
"If that thing reaches us, I don't know if there will be a crusade. Look at what it carries."
I took the scope again. The barge was growing closer. and larger. But now I saw more than just the rabid cultists on it. I saw 3 massive sights that sent my blood running cold. They were taller than anything I could have imagined, larger than 3 Highlanders stacked, huge and built like enormous behemoths, skin a flaming red and eyes of molten fire. Huge horns grew from their heads, and their massive jaws were filled with hungry and bloody teeth. Large bat-like wings beat wildly as if yearning to carry these demonic freaks into the air, but the salty sea air was too strong, and the storm made that risk too great for them. They were carrying enormous axes in hand and were howling and roaring so loudly, even from this distance I could hear it. They were monsters. Nothing short of monsters. In God's name, what are those things? Bloodthirsters, champion demons of the chaos god Khorne. The fact that the demon was given authority to call these 3 into battle says a great deal about what the Heathmoore warriors were expecting to face, and I can't say I envied them. They're like demons. Are we facing monsters of hell itself? I cried. Von Ling did not answer. I looked around, hoping for some kind of answer or solution. What do we do? How do we deal with this?
I can send orders to the fleet to steer away, but if they pursue and catch us, as they likely will, whatever ship they reach will certainly be reduced to flotsam.
Von Ling sighed. But we can't possibly... Excuse me. I turned with Von Ling to see a man standing there. He was bare-chested, his face painted, and his hair and beard styled in a dirty and rugged manner. He held a hammer in his hand and had a stern expression. A Jormungandr, one of the cultists of Storr Stronghold. It was Gelder, one of the leaders of the Jormungandr warriors who had volunteered to join the fleet. He looked out at the barge in the far distance, and then to Von Ling. Me and my kin will deal with them for you. No, I answered. We need your Jormungandr for the final fight. You'll have enough. But if those demons close in on us, then we ain't got a prayer, right? He explained. We do not fear death or the sea. It is they who should fear us. I snorted that classic Viking zeal that I'd grown to appreciate from the Valkenheim natives. Still, it seemed folly in the face of what those monsters were. I don't like it.
I'm afraid there's no other way, and that storm is closing in too fast,
Von Ling pointed out. I growled to myself as lightning began to flash overhead. I looked to Gelder like a man destined to die. Are you aware of what you're asking to do? Oh, believe me. I know what I'm doing, he answered with a sneer. I do not fear death. I welcome it. I sighed and looked back at the massive barge and nodded at last. Then God be with you. To Ragnarok, Night Warden. I watched as Gelder ran to the edge of the ship and let out a loud howl that seemed to carry on the waves and thunder. Lightning flashed in the distance as if to summon forth the 3 Jormungandr junks. They were little more than floating driftwood, but they held up to 60 Jormungandr, a few berserkers, and raiders. Vikings all, sworn to the cult of the Jormungandr serpent. I never had any love for zealots, but even as I watched them row towards the barge of chaos cultists and those 3 mighty demons, I couldn't stop myself from shivering with fear for their lives. I just couldn't pull my gaze away, and I felt Von Ling beside me. Though the fleet continued to move toward the storm, the barge and the Jormungandr were set to clash. They roared like men possessed, and I watched with horror the instant the 2 wooden barges met. It took no time for all the combatants to rush each other. Jormungandr flung themselves off their junk and slammed their hammers into exposed bones and meat. Screams of rage, pleasure, and excitement mingled with roars of pain and cries of death. The Chaos Cultists were swift to respond, slashing with long, crude swords and axes. But they'd never fought the Vikings before, clearly, because brute force is their own game, and I knew from personal experience how gifted they were in fighting with fury. A raider charged one cultist off the barge completely, throwing him into the waves. I watched a berserker throw himself at an unsuspecting cultist and hacked his neck from his shoulders. But most impressive were the hammer-wielding zealots. I'd only fought Jormungandrs once or twice in my time. I'd had very little experience with how they handled themselves. But losses death, pain. It all brushed off them like the spray of the sea. If one fell off the barge or fell to a barbarian blade, they didn't even seem dazed, or even afraid. Some even laughed at the blood spraying from open wounds. What possessed these men and women? How could they fight like this? How could anyone? To be honest, their tactics and behavior reminded me a lot of the very cultists they were fighting. However, no matter how skilled the fighters may be, I watched their doom approach on giant red feet. The massive demons attacked, and the Jormungandr were slaughtered with each swing of its massive axe. I watched as pieces of human limbs were launched across the air and into the waters. With each swing, the beast's axes broke through bodies and into the barge itself, splintering wood and steel. But the Jormungandr and the Vikings as a whole, they wouldn't stop attacking it. Like hornets, they swarmed the monster and hammered at every exposed point, at every raised joint. It was all futile. Even they should have seen that, their blows barely registering to the mighty brute who tossed them aside with such ease. "Gelder, your fellows die in droves," I shouted to him. The Jormungandr just looked out at the carnage, baring his teeth. "We spill our blood for a higher calling, for our father, for our purpose." "They die, Gelder," I cried. "Order a retreat." "Yours is to lead our armies to victory, Night Warden. It is ours to die against this obstacle," Gelder answered. I was furious, turning again to watch as the once 60 or 70 Jormungandr and Vikings had been reduced to only about 20 or so in mere minutes. The battle had been so brief, I was mortified at the 3 giant demons as they were now closing in on their quarry, preparing to slay them. I saw the remaining Jormungandr warriors, all exhausted and bleeding, kneeling on the barge, breathing heavily, their fervor and energy spent. I grit my teeth and watched, ready to see them shattered.
"I'm afraid that wasn't enough time. Those monsters will be upon us soon enough, so I hope you have a plan, Night Warden,"
Fondling called. I looked to her with fear. Even with all that sacrifice, it hadn't even bought us the time we needed to get away. Suddenly, Gelder jumped up on the edge of the ship, raised his hammer to the cloudy sky. "Ragnarok!" he bellowed. The crash of thunder and the flash of lightning rained overhead, and the rain began to fall. It is here that I must pause the narrative briefly to reveal the portion of events that William is unaware of. I had been in the airship at this point, as said before, with the Sisters of the Sacred Spear and Su Ying. We had been observing the battle briefly from above, and I saw the perilous situation the warriors found themselves in. But even I didn't know how to aid them. If we tried to fire on the bloodthirsters, we would only spark their ire further. But it was then that Zhu Ying suddenly started screaming. She fell to the floor, clutching her head, howling in pain. I asked her what was wrong, what had happened. And then she looked to me. I'll never forget the fear in those glassy orbs as she said what she said next. "It rises." I watched, and I couldn't believe what I saw. Every Jormungandr on the barge and every Viking in the fleet, on every ship, were stamping their feet in a rhythmic pattern, a pounding of foot on wood that sent a metronome across the water and into the stormy air. I grabbed the side of the ship, and Fondling gripped it as well. Gelder let out the pounding feet of his fellows, leading them on, and I felt it. Something moving, something changing in the bowels of the sea. The lightning flashed again, and this time the massive demons paused. They must have noticed something wrong themselves, and were now looking confused. Gelder then held up his hands, his fist and hammer raised to the sky. "Father, we offer you our blood, we offer you our lives, and we offer you victory! Jormungandr, rise!" The water bubbled and quaked. The waves rushed and thrashed like slapping claws, and there was a great roar like the rushing of an angry wind. "Hang on!" I roared. And then I saw it. I saw it rising from the sea, the creature I'd only heard of in legend, massive and covered in scales like blue midnight, its eyes glowing with the lightning of a storm, and its massive hood reared and open, bathing us all in its nocturne night. It towered so large that even the mighty demons seemed no more than mice in comparison. Its snake head looked down at the barge before it. It opened its mouth, revealing two long, drooling fangs. A long, loud hiss that hurt my ears and made my hair stand on end escaped its massive throat. "The Jormungandr," I whispered. The demons stared at the beast only a moment before raising their axes and rushing toward it as if they even stood a chance. The snake seemed to sneer before turning its gaze to us and to the fleet. Gelder was still leading the stamping of the feet, the howling to the storm, and the snake turned itself back to its targets. "Father!" Gelder screamed. "Grant us your blessing! Deliver these foul creatures to Helheim!" The snake seemed to acknowledge the call of his disciple, and then opened its massive mouth. Lightning burst from its jaws and crashed to the deck of our ship. Every man and woman was thrown backwards by the sudden eruption of light and heat, and when I was finally able to stand and look again, pushing the bright discoloration from my eyes, I saw it. A glowing white-hot hammer. Etched in were the sigils of the Viking gods, and there was a pulsing energy coming off of it that I knew was not of this world. Gelder beamed at it, and then raised his fist. "Hail the serpent!" he shouted, and every Viking followed him in the cheer. The demons finally made their attack, hacking at the giant snake. The serpent turned its attention back to its attackers, and then, with a furious hiss, reared back its head and struck down. The crash of the monster's head into the barge shattered the wooden structure, and the demons were thrown clear while one was eaten whole. The other two were thrown into the water, but the plunging beast's head had caused all the water to rush back, creating a bitter and angry whirlpool. The Jormungandr's barges fared no better, and I watched as the serpent's own disciples were dragged down with their foe's ship. But even as they fell to their doom, they never stopped fighting, flinging themselves headlong at the demons, following their master into the depths. As I stared stupidly, Fan Ling turned her face away, focusing on the storm ahead.
"I want us out of these waters right now,"
Fan Ling hissed. And I didn't blame her, not one bit. I walked to Gelder as he lifted the glowing hammer that remained. As the seas began to calm again, or rather as calm as a stormy sea can be, it was as if the snake had never been there. And other than the driftwood that still floated, had you not noticed it, you never would have thought it had happened. The lightning and thunder overhead singing a chorus that reminded us that the worst was yet to come. "How did you—" "No, I'd rather not ask," I sighed. "Will that weapon serve us well?" "Aye," Gelder answered, "but I cannot wield it. It'll be Ayla's to wield, the shield maiden who leads Valkenheim on this crusade of yours. She will bear the weight of Thor's hammer. I will see that she receives it when we make landfall." "Good. I'm sorry for your men," I finally offered. "Do not be," he answered. "They were glad to make the sacrifice, proud to die, to bring forth our father. To witness our master just once, and to die bringing him forth, is the greatest honor we can achieve. To fight alongside him, no finer death is possible." I watched him marvel at the hammer, and I nodded, turning my back on him to join Fan Ling. The Vikings never made sense to me, and the more I learned, the more I began to realize that their ideas of honor and glory were frightening to consider. I always saw them as a people to be wary of, but now I felt nothing but fear, knowing not that they commanded a great monster like that, but that they would rush to death without a second thought. Were we all only so brave as that? I have no doubt that the monster the Jormungandr summoned is not a normal one, and I'm almost certain it is of the warp somehow, but I dare not inquire too deeply about it. I also speculate that they summoned it because of the sacrifice of the initial vanguard. Those Jormungandr and Vikings who were killed and their blood splattered to the sea somehow were the catalyst with which to call it, though I cannot prove this, and I have no real interest in proving it. I merely watched as the creature vanished beneath the waves, and the seas returned to their stormy nature again. The fleet was free to move on, but now my mind was on several other factors. Bloodthirsters were a real threat. Would we encounter more, Or were there worse things waiting in Wyverndale? I would discover the answer to this soon enough, and in a manner I wish I had not.